Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes as we let folks in. We welcome you this morning. And just to note, this event is being recorded. Thank you. Good morning again, everyone. Please enter your name and the agency you represent in the chat. We'll get started in just a couple more minutes. We want to make sure we have a full house. So we look forward to this event. Thank you. Okay. So just wanted to get started, wanted to do a few housekeeping items. My name is Franny Desai. I'm from the Office of Child Abuse Prevention at the California Department of Social Services. We welcome you this morning. And just to start off, I wanted to explain the chat function feature. Just as a reminder, I know folks have been using Zoom for a while now, these past 2 years, but just in case, please feel free to use the chat function if you have any direct messages that you need to share with the with everyone on the audience. However, we do also have a Q&A function, a question and answer function button. And please use this to ask any questions. And at the end of the session, we will be doing a Q&A portion that will be hosted by Mike Finley from the Haywood Burns Institute. We appreciate your time this morning, and I'm going to pass it off to our branch chief at CDSS, Cheryl Treadwell.
Thank you, Franny. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first session of the Child Abuse Prevention Month Speaker Series. As Franny said, I am Cheryl Treadwell. I am the Chief of the Safety Prevention and Early Intervention Branch at the Department of Social Services. I am very excited to kick off this series with the leaders from the W. Haywood Burns Institute, Michael Finley and Samantha Mellerson is not here today. I understand she's a bit under the weather, so we're going to be sending healing vibes her way. As you know, the W. Haywood Burns Institute has been dedicated to challenging racial hierarchy by advocating for and establishing a community-centered approach to dismantle structural racism and building a more community-centered structural well-being approach to work. So today's presentation will focus on understanding the historical context of structural racism and current day implications, how we got here, and a better path forward. So as you listen, I want you to notice what you're noticing, and as you experience this presentation and we work toward doing this transformational work, we've all heard that in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you come from. How often have we heard that? And history now is being revisited in a way for many of us, and that revision has been a painful experience. But what good can we get from this is that we must change to get to better. So I hope as you listen that you begin to think about what actions you might support to move this better pathway forward. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Michael Finley, our guest speaker, to kick off this presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that introduction and that context setting. And I love the, transformation, right? And we all hear that language and, it's a bit of a buzzword in a way. And so it's about what do we really do? And so, I'm looking forward. We'll jump in whenever we can share the slide deck. Kelly, you can go ahead with that. And just one little, I can't see you all because in webinar format, I know you're there because I can see the numbers. I have two dogs who don't listen to anything I say, and so they may bark during this, but I'll try to prevent that. But that's just a real life thing that I want to acknowledge. And also, my colleague Sam Mellison, like Cheryl said, is really sick, so just not here today, but otherwise would have been and sent her her energy to the group as we go through for today. But just wanted to acknowledge my partner in this work. We can go ahead. Next slide, and then the next slide. Cool, thank you. And so this is just a sketch of W. Haywood Burns, who's our organization's namesake, and we just always bring him into the room. It helps center us in everything that we do. Someone whose shoulders we stand upon. He was a mentor to our founder, James Bell, and Haywood was a pillar in the civil rights and human rights community. He was a lawyer who represented folks like Angela Davis in the 60s and other Black activists. He was general counsel for Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign and worked on post-apartheid South African Constitution and actually died tragically 26 years ago now in South Africa at a human rights conference. And so we have close ties with his family and just someone we always reflect when we go into spaces because he and among many are sort of the folks who you don't always know their names have played a huge role in how we even got to the changes we've seen up until today. I just wanted to shout him out. And go to the next slide. And just so as Cheryl kind of was laying out for you today, we're going to have a couple slides just on some concepts, terms, and I don't mean basic in a bad way, but really just we don't ever assume where folks are in their journey around racial, ethnic equity work. And so there's just some terms we want to just kind of put out so everybody sort of a baseline understanding. We'll talk about history and we'll walk through a crosswalk of development of human service systems, particularly youth justice and child welfare, and how structural racism has impacted the development of those systems and what that looks like, right? How do we get to where we are today? And these are the issues that you are all working on. When Cheryl puts out the language transformation, it's all of us are trying to figure this out, right? So we'll give some historical context. And then over a few slides and sort of, all right, with all of that heaviness that seems massive, it seems large, what do we do? And just some tactic strategies on how we actually address these issues, things you can hopefully take back to your homes, to your counties, where you're doing the work and employ them if you're not already doing some of them. Go to the next slide. So just some core terms we like to just kind of put out for folks, just again, to get everybody kind of on the same baseline. When we think about we talk about 4 levels of racism, right? And just to take you through them from top to bottom, personal is sort of personal, interpersonal, the two we're most familiar with. So personal is our own private beliefs and prejudices, right? Ideas, that we have about superiority of whites and the inferiority of people of color, different ways we all carry out our personal beliefs that we may carry. Interpersonal is what we see, right, in the world often, right? Interpersonal, the expression of racism between individuals. So all the Karen in the Park stories, and all the things we've seen the last two years, particularly in social media, right, is the interpersonal piece. And then you start to get into these larger, broader contexts of racism, right? Institutional and structural. So institutional, really looking at discriminatory treatment, policies and practices within organizations and institutions, right? What's happening within the walls of the spaces, the Zoom boxes of the organizations, institutions within which we all work or engage now, right? And then structural. So a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work to perpetuate racial inequity. And when we think about transformation and concepts like transformation or reimagining, we've heard a lot about that, it is really to attack the structural. And so as we go through today's presentation, particularly as we think about the history, you know, think about the structural piece of it, right? There are interpersonal and personal examples of race and racism that we can talk about and we will highlight, but really think about how it exists within these structures, right? And the impact of the structures. And when we think of transformation, how do we deconstruct these current structures for change, right? How do we continue to evolve what we're doing? And so just wanted to give everyone those sort of 4 ways that we think, the 4 levels of racism as we talk about them. Go to the next slide. So another framework we like to introduce to folks as we think about structural racism and how it manifests is othering and belonging. And so some folks may be familiar with John Powell, who's at the Othering and Belonging Institute at Cal Berkeley. And he developed this concept, right, this notion of othering, a generalized set of processes that denies someone's full humanity based on them being less than or a threat to the favored group, right? And it's important to note that as he developed this, the opposite of othering is not belonging. I mean, it's not saming, but it's belonging, right? Because sometimes we think, well, we all have to be the same. His point is really about belonging, right? Not just how we treat each other, but it's how we organize our economy, our structures, our schools, our faith, so that everyone belongs, while recognizing we still have differences. And when we read that, right, all of us were once children, we were once playing with other children. These seem like very simple lessons that we've all heard, right? But as we get older, we stop following them. And so sometimes when at Burns, we just talk about, you know, getting back in the sandbox, and I'm aging myself, I don't know if there's still sandboxes now, but right, being able to play in a way and accept people they just come to the playground, they just play, right? And so how do we create belonging? And that's where we're really trying to go. And the other reason we talk about othering and belonging is because it's a framework that all of us can resonate with. We've all been othered, whether you think about 6th grade and trying to find a seat at the lunch table, right? Or something that might have happened yesterday. We all have that experience of feeling like we're out of, you know, we're not the favored, whatever it is, right? And so feeling that feeling. And so just again, as we go through the slides, think about the concept of othering and how it applies as we talk about structural racism and its impact on the historical development of the systems within which we work. Go to the next slide. I wish Sam was here for this one because this actually is one of my favorite slides. I'm going to make a reference, and again, I cannot see your faces. I'm going to trust that you're going to participate in my question. So this slide is called discriminatory design. When we talk about structural racism, often it can be about policies and practices, and it can feel somewhat abstract sometimes for folks. And so discriminatory design is really a reflection of what structural racism looks like in the physicality of it, in actual buildings, right? So this is a bridge built by a man, Robert Moses, this is in New York. It's on the Southern State Parkway, which runs from New York City out to Long Island. He built these bridges. He built this bridge and other bridges like it low on purpose. They're built low. They were built low to prevent public transportation buses from being able to come from the city to these beaches in Long Island. What this really was about was not wanting, and in his language, right, Black folk, Puerto Ricans, Jewish people who were in the city, wanting to prevent them from going out to these beaches, which were primarily for white people. And so again, it's just giving you a real physical, like what does this look like in practice? And when you think about the concepts of like redlining, that's another one, right? When you think about, often we see benches in parks that have spikes on them to prevent people from being able to sleep on them. There are these things where we talk about discriminatory design, and it just gives you real physical representation of what structural racism looks like in practice. The reason I reference this being a slide I like is because there's also a movie, Motherless Brooklyn, that apparently I'm the only person who's ever seen it, that sort of is based loosely on Robert Moses and his development of the New York City metropolitan area, right? And this sort of avowed racism and how he interacted with people. And so it's just an interesting look at this individual who had a lot of power in New York. And so we can go to the next slide. And I see in the chat someone mentioning, right, the highways. And so the whole, and just on that, like the highway system was created in many places where it definitely went through communities of color and harmed those communities, right? And so there's a great example. Oh, and I see someone actually saw the movie. Awesome. So this is great. So this slide, white supremacy culture. And so when we throw this slide up, often it's when people get a little tight. Everybody gets a little tight. And just want to read it, and then we'll talk about it. A form of racism, so white supremacy culture, a form of racism centered upon the belief that white people are superior to people of other racial backgrounds. This manifests as white dominant culture, which shapes our institutions, our media, and the way we see ourselves and others through a normative middle class lens, white middle class lens. Here's the point of this, and the reason we talk about this is white supremacy culture is not owned by white people. I want to be really clear about that. White supremacy culture is not owned by white people. We all swim in this. And so that bottom line, you see the pictures of a fish, right? The longer you swim in the culture, the more invisible it becomes. It's really the water, right? And we all swim in it. And so the work we have to do to continue toward transformation, which is a journey, is to keep unpacking and pulling apart and deconstructing this culture. And again, it's not the responsibility of any one group because we all swim within this white dominant culture. It's just a part of, how we exist. We have another exercise we do sometimes with groups where we'll have a bunch of photos of things and have people kind of just from their own lens speak to them. What do they mean to you, right? And so for some folks, if you look at Dennis the Menace, it's just Dennis the Menace, right? Again, I'm aging myself on cartoons. But other folks will say, wow, if that was a young person of color, Dennis the Menace wouldn't be so cute to some people, right? Just understanding how we all exist within this fishbowl, we have to figure out how to free ourselves and see it differently, right? So that culture doesn't become invisible. Next slide. And this is just a definition of one of the definitions or a definition of structural racism. And really, I think the point here is just, and it's what we just spoke about in the last slide, is the normalization of this, right? It just becomes sort of the water we swim in, right? And so the structural racism in the U.S. is the normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal that routinely advantage white people while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. It's this normalization that then binds together white-controlled institutions, interlocking them into larger systems of power and control. And just remember the definitions that I started with, those core concepts, that this isn't to say that every white person has some existence that is completely different than people of color, right? To say that there's structures that we've normalized certain things, right, that create that white dominant culture. And so again, it's to pull apart the interpersonal and the personal from the institutional and the structural as we think of racism. Next slide. So one of the other concepts is we think about, okay, so how do you actually do transformation? What does that even mean? How do we break out of this? How do we deal with these massive issues, right? And one of the things we talk about is mental models, and not sure how familiar folks are with mental models. What's interesting as we continue to do our work and grow our work and evolve is mental models in the business world are super common. You can look up a ton of articles on them, from Elon Musk to whoever talking about mental models. In the human services space, it's less talked about, but they still obviously exist. It's just an interesting point of information. And really, it's an explanation of our thought process and how we understand the world around us, right? It guides how we think, how we perceive things, and what we do, right? The beauty of mental models is that first of all, they're not all bad. There's great mental models, there's bad mental models, there's harmful mental models, there's protective mental models. But that all mental models, right, you can be introspective and really re-engineer them. And so, but they're an important part of how we think about when we think about structural racism and how do we impact it, the power of these mental models, right? And the work is we need to unpack our mental models and then make an explicit choice to believe something different so we can do something different. You can go to the next slide. And so a lot of folks might have seen the this iceberg example before, right? And the point is, and I'm going to use just an example of a common cold. If you think about we're going to go from the top, what you see, the top of the iceberg, right? That's the event. And if you just think of a cold, right? You get a cold. So that's what just happened. That's the event. The pattern is you get more colds and you see it, right? What trends have been over time? I'm getting colds a lot often. Then the underlying structure. So now we're under the water now. Now we're in the things we don't often see, right? What's influencing these patterns? I'm getting sick often. What's that about? I'm working excessive hours, not eating well, right? I don't have access to healthy food. So these different things play a huge role in that. But then it's the mental model at the very bottom of the iceberg. What assumptions, beliefs, and values we hold about the system, what keeps the system in place. In the cold example, right, it's the classic career is most important, right? Or work more, and more, right? Working less means you're weak or you're not as prosperous, right? So the work of transformation is really to unpack the mental model. And the work of transformation is to get past our quick reactions to events and thinking that if I have a cold and me taking an aspirin is the actual fix. Because the more I understand the patterns and trends, the more I understand the underlying structures, the more I understand the mental models that really impact why I'm getting sick, right? That's the root causes. That's the actual things we need to address. And so mental models for us are really, really important as we think about how do we get towards transformation, the transformation that Cheryl highlighted in her opening. You can go to the next slide. And so understanding that where I want to shift now is to start to talk. We're going to take you through I'll take you through a history walk. A couple of things, right? I think folks get it, right? History, it's important to understand it. When a lot of places and people say, well, why do we need to know what that is? And I think Cheryl spoke to that a little bit. It's really understanding that the systems within which we work now that we are trying to reform, that we are trying to either abolish, reform, whatever language, reimagine, transform, they were built and designed in very intentional ways. And it's important for us to understand that, particularly as we think about race and ethnicity and work and social justice work in that space, right? How do we disrupt these systems and continue to make them more effective for people? We believe that having this historical competence is critical to that work. As I go through these slides, I also want to just note that this is not the world's or the country's, exhaustive history. It's what I'll take you through is some themes, some highlights, and try to tie some things together for folks to see the commonalities and how history has sort of replayed itself over time. You can go to the next slide. So this slide, the next few slides are going to speak to Native American land, First Nations land in this country, and the theft of those lands, because that's really such a powerful starting place. It's one of the backdrops for how systems were developed, is this theft of land. And just to note, even language, when we talk about othering, one of the things with othering, the framework I talked about a few slides ago, is the power of language. So even I'm always struck by even the language of Indian land cession, which I think is how you say it. That's really the stealing of land. But even how we language it, it seems as if if someone came to your house and took all your stuff, you wouldn't call police and say, well, somebody's possession or whatever the version of word you would use, right? So even when we think about languaging, the power of it when used to soften things, right, or to distract, so just be aware of that as we talk about this. We can go to the next slide. And so the next couple of slides, we can just sit on this one for a second, and then we'll go to the next one. It shows you the greens were tribal lands, and what you'll see in pretty much after 1810, there's 10-year increments where you see the shift, right, of the theft of Native American land. And we can go to the next slide. And you can see how the green disappears, right? Those tribal lands disappear and it becomes whiter and whiter and whiter. And that's just an important backdrop to, right, as we start thinking about the growth of systems and the impact and who was impacted. And so we just always like to start with this because this is such a, if you really sit with this, and California was, as many of you know, was impacted by the stealing of this land. And there are counties, you know, in California that were created completely by Europeans taking land from indigenous populations, right? And so just to be aware that this is an important backdrop within which we start as we think about the historical walk in this country. And you can go to the next slide. And then obviously, the transatlantic slave trade, right? And we think about the impact of that. 13 million estimated enslaved Africans were forced to the Americas during this time, right? And when we think about the brutality of this, and so again, this is just context, right? To understand this and the previous couple of slides are the backdrop to where when we start thinking about, again, the development of the systems within which we work. And we think it's important to have that as your sort of baseline for where we're going. So the next slide. So now, sort of with that context, with that backdrop, right, we are now in if you think about the 1600s, first slave ship docked in Jamestown, 1619. There's this notion of children are presumed to be born with sin and evil, and that notion is it's not a Puritan notion. I'm from Massachusetts, so I grew up with the whole Puritan concept, and that was something the Pilgrims, Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims was highlighted in very intense ways. But that piece about sin and evil and children being presumed born with those characteristics is not a new thing. It's actually historical of how adults view children. But important to understand that it played a huge role in the early 1600s and led to the family was really the unit of social control. So government and private institutions were not actively involved in any aspect of how parents raised their children. We referenced the Stubborn and Rebellious Act of Massachusetts. There were similar acts in other colonies and then states subsequently. But this was an act where if you were a 16-year-old boy, and it was eventually extended out to daughters as well, and you were disobedient, didn't listen to your parents, you could be put to death. There is an adult reflex of wanting to know how many times that happened. And what we would say is, well, philosophically, this speaks to the philosophy about how adults looked at young people, which plays a role in some other things that will happen throughout history that are problematic and harmful towards communities, particularly communities of color. And again, that last bullet, that understanding that slavery, that the stealing of Native American land, that again, that's that backdrop that's existing during this period of time. You can go to the next slide. So now the 1800s, and so in the late 1700s, when you start to see private institutions and government become a bit more involved in the welfare of young people and families related to how they raise their children. The 1800s, you see, right, large-scale societal shift, industrialization. So we're starting to see people move into cities, particularly in the Northeast, right? You see the Indian Removal Act was signed, First Nations boarding schools, and that movement began. And I think it's important. One of the themes to just acknowledge through our history is that there are notions that would be seen as liberal and were often driven by whites who were considered liberal that were still very problematic and harmful to communities of color. So Captain Richard Pratt, who's sort of seen as the father of the boarding school movement, was seen by himself and was seen by many as an ally to Native American communities, right? But he was also the one who stated, kill the savage, save the man. And so it's just, there's understanding that piece of it, because there are themes throughout our history when that plays out. The other piece here is the Humane Society founded the National Federation of Child Rescue Agencies to investigate child maltreatment. Again, what we would say is that's a positive move forward, just understanding the philosophy that this agency was modeled after an animal rights organization. And so again, when we talk about how just young people were viewed, right, this speaks to that. And narratives, even, not to be silly or dismissive, right, the narratives around the importance of animals versus the importance of some people, right? And so just that's these narratives still exist and sometimes even in current day conversations. And then we're starting to see, again, a bigger presence during the 1800s of private child protection agencies playing a bigger role in looking after families and young people, distinct from what occurred in the 1600s, early 1600s. Next slide. So as the systems are now becoming born and growing, I'll take you from the blue box and kind of we'll go clockwise, or actually I don't know how we're gonna do it. The New York House of Refuge, 1825. Houses of refuge, if you think of them, they're sort of the first juvenile reformatories. The Quakers did a study, and so again, I want you to think of just narrative and things we hear in today. The study said and showed that young people were distinct, different, acting different behaviors than adults. And so they shouldn't be held in the same facilities as adults when they got in trouble, right? So these are things we talk about now around brain development for young people and just other distinctions we make, understanding that young people and adults are different. So the Houses of Refuge, which started in New York in 1825, proliferated around the country. They were a space you could go for etiquette, reform, kind of this moral piece, right? You could learn a trade, a skill. These were often, though, and this gets to the theme I said about sort of white liberals and things that were created that were good, but who they benefited. So often these were focused on European immigrants, Italian, Irish young people, right? You can see in this example, the colored section in New York did not open until 1834. And often, and we'll have a slide in a few slides, will demonstrate even further why often these houses of refuge didn't necessarily benefit communities of color in the same way they did for those European immigrant families. We note in 1848, probation was created in the United States. The father of the modern day probation in the United States was John Augustus, and we reference him because he was not a judge, he was not a politician or law enforcement, he was a bootmaker. And so when we think about concepts and ideas, right, about what, for example, probation is, and as the Virgin Institute, we're currently in Los Angeles working to remove the probation department and create a department of youth development, right? So this is all real life happening, right? And how we think about probation, our point is it comes from really a community lens. John Augustus was someone who said, he went in Massachusetts, he went to the court and said, let me take some of these adults instead of having them go into the system and going to jail. He then moved that to young people as well. And his idea was I can work with them and give them a skill, right? And disrupt the sort of rail to jail. And so again, just our point is to note that he was a community person and who was trying to just figure out ways to engage people to keep them out of the system, right? And often that's lost in the current day thinking about things like probation. Not sure how familiar folks are with the orphan train movement. Charles Loring Brace, who was a child advocate out of New York, and a few other folks really are the parents of the orphan train movement. The idea was that you had industrialization occurring. You had a lot of young people who were going unsupervised. And the idea was and so again, think about the narratives and conversations we even have today. The idea was to take them and send them, often via train, to live with hardworking, Midwestern, strong valued families, right? So these are narratives we still hear to this day when we think about different parts of the country. And so the orphan train movement it moved lots of young people to Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, different states throughout the country. There's a complexity with how race and ethnicity even shows up in this space. The race ethnicity didn't really come up until a group of Irish Catholic boys, the Catholic Church is a big proponent of the orphan train movement, were sent to Arizona, to two towns in Arizona. The white men in those two towns rioted and forcibly removed some of those children from the Mexican Catholic families they were going to. There's an author who writes about, if you understand the notion of race in this country and how it was created, that those kids were Irish and Irish was not considered white. But on that train ride to the Southwest, to Arizona, to those Mexican Catholic families, they became white. And so it's just the power and complexity of race, ethnicity in this country and how it plays out. The other piece of the orphan train movement is a lot of these kids were not orphans, but were poor. Their families were poor. And that Charles Loring Brace and this orphan train concept really is sort of in many spaces considered like the birthplace of the modern day foster care system, which is understanding those roots and being aware of that as part of it for those that were not. And then that last box, we often highlight the Whittier School, which was a school, and folks may be familiar in Whittier, California, that closed not so many years ago. And in the late 1800s, 1900s, the children, the young people would go there often were Latino boys, a lot, disproportionately Latino boys, often Spanish speaking. They'd be tested in English. They would fail those tests and be considered mentally deficient, categorized as mentally deficient. And then many of those boys were sterilized. Right? And so again, just understanding the impact of these systems, the generational impact of these systems and what that leads to. So just wanted to highlight that. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, and so when we think of mental models, we show this slide, and if we were all in person, we would engage it a bit differently, but we used to call this hidden brutality. And we really said it's not so hidden. And so we'd ask you, well, what seems the most brutal? And people often go right to the punishment in the forced labor camp. The young African-American boy looks like he's tied up on a post when we think about brutality. But in essence, the stripping of someone's culture, when you look at the Lakota boys in those two pictures in their traditional dress, and then, looks more like they're involved at boarding school and how they had to dress. The stripping of culture is just as brutal. And so we think of our mental models when we consider brutal, why we think of that, what that looks like, right? We think this is a great or a powerful demonstration, and even to challenge ourselves about what we consider brutality, what we consider violence, because the stripping of culture, we would say, is definitely violent and brutal, just as brutal as the physical punishment in the forced labor camp. Next slide. And so if you remember the orphan, because I just talked about it, the orphan train movement. And so here you see a lot of these are young African-American boys who weren't even in the orphan train movement, right? Because they were part of the convict leasing system, right? A system used by prisons to lease prisoners to private parties, such as corporations and plantation owners. The power of this is that 73%, an example of the power, 73% of Alabama's entire state revenue in 1898 came from convict leasing, right? And so just again, understanding the impact that it has, the generational impact that has, and that this is really the start of the prison industrial complex, right, as we look at it. And so just again, the context of what's happening during the 1800s as systems are now beginning to develop, who's impacted, who's experiencing systems, who's not even involved, who's excluded, right, due to situations like convict leasing and their impact on communities of color. Next slide. So a lot of folks are familiar with the concept of eugenics, right? Pseudoscience that was really designed to weed out what were considered folks with weaker genes, right? And gets around procreating. And so interestingly, Francis Galton, who's sort of seen as the father of eugenics, was the half cousin of Darwin, right? Survival of the fittest. What's important here, and you all can read, obviously when we think of eugenics, often the first example we think of is Hitler and the Holocaust. It's important to note that the Nazis actually looked at the American eugenics movement as somewhat of a guide. And they used it as a defense after World War II to say that they were simply following what was happening in the United States. Eugenics was very normalized during the late 1800s and early 1900s. It was normalized to the degree that it was within academia, within colleges, talked about. College professors, college presidents were supporters of it. And so it's just really important to make that connection. The bottom right-hand picture, which says eugenics, it's a publication, and it says the editorial board. And one of the editorial board members, Samuel J. Holmes, who was a well-known professor at Cal Berkeley, a zoologist at Cal Berkeley, right? So you had professors at very prominent schools being a part of this movement, right? David Starr Jordan, who was the chancellor president of Stanford University, was a proponent of eugenics, right? And spoke about how the characteristics like poverty, talent, etc., come through your blood, right? And have these interesting sort of, off the wall notions. And so again, it's just to say how normalized it was. The Carnegie family, the Rockefeller family were supporters of this. Again, so just to give you a sense, and you can see in this slide that California has large numbers of sterilizations, right? Often forced sterilizations based on people being seen as feeble-minded. And so we don't mention this to be provocative. We mention this because it is a part of our history. And when you look at your own state or your own county's involvement with it, often you see connections that can be surprising and disturbing. It's just to know that, but the normalization of eugenics and the concept, right, was integrated with the development of these systems within which we work, right? The leaders and thinkers around these systems were often folks who supported this. And so just to be aware of that. And we can go to the next slide. And so this is just a picture of victims of lynching from 1882 to 1968. And really just to show the breadth of this slide, the next slide just shows the breadth of lynching and violence, right? The point is the violence that was occurring toward community of color. And it wasn't just a Southern problem. Obviously, numbers were large there, but it was Southern Midwest, occurred in California, occurred around the country. And we always, in this point, shout out if you ever have an opportunity, if you have not been, to go to Montgomery, to Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative Museum, where he has a museum that follows mass incarceration, kind of slavery, right before slavery till current, but also has a really powerful memorial that documents 4,000 lynchings across the country and the counties where they occurred. And it's just a really moving, very intense memorial that we just always tell people if you're in Alabama or in Atlanta, it's a 2-hour drive to go to Montgomery to visit that. You can go to the next slide. I just show this picture, depending on where you are in the state. If we were all together, I'd make you guess where it was. But often when we do this, people say, right, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. This actually is on Pacific Avenue in Santa Cruz, California, right? And that's the Klan. This is July 4th, 1927. And so just again, I think just to make the point that these weren't just Southern issues, that the depth of the threat of violence, right, wasn't just a Southern issue, but really was everywhere. Just to give you a real life example, not sure if someone is from Santa Cruz County on the call, but just to know that, these are things that occurred. They didn't occur just in the 1800s, but this is 1927. Next slide. And so now as we get into the 1900s, and I won't go through everything, but we start to see these shifts, right? An increase in juvenile courts being present in states, an increase in non-government child protection societies. The 40 states established mothers' pensions, right? Which is just this idea of like, we're going to subsidize, support mothers who don't have a male income in the house. But then you see who's excluded from that, right? Who don't receive those benefits, right? And so that plays a role in how we got to where we are today. When we talk about othering, the internment camps of Japanese Americans during World War II and the impact that had on counties and cities and towns around the country, including in California, right, is really important to understand the impact of that and how it connects to the concept of othering. And then we see federal protections start to be put in place, the JJDPA, ICWA, again, to look at First Nations, the removal of First Nations children, so just to see the late 70s. And I just saw in the chat, I'm following the chat as well, the Klan of South Dakota. I mean, so just to know that this is not all from, 400 years ago, but much more current and real and impactful. You can go to the next slide. And so now we're getting into, I'm now of an age where this, the war on drugs and starting in the 70s and start to look at the 1990s, what we're seeing, right? So the war on drugs, which caused a huge impact on mass incarceration and increase in our prison population. We see mass media starting to look a certain way at sort of if it bleeds, it leads, right? The Central Park jogger case, which I think most folks are probably familiar with, But the point of that is that it was 5 young men who were falsely accused of sexually assaulting a white woman who was jogging in Central Park. These young men were in prison for many years and had their lives really turned upside down. And so in the same way that we heard about the mass media and how much it was focused on if it bleeds, it leads, right? When these young men were acquitted, found actually innocent, we didn't hear very much about it until Ava DuVernay's documentary or docudrama on Netflix in 2019, right? So it's important to understand that when we look at Family Preservation Act, right? So we saw the impact of response to foster care placements growing so much. The whole country was being impacted by the recession, by AIDS, crack, all of those things were existing, which led to the mass media starting to tell certain narratives that played on people's fears of certain people, people's fears of Black and Latino boys particularly, right? And that's very much what the Central Park jogger case reflected. And the juvenile super predator theory we just always highlighted because John Giulio, who was the person who sort of coined the term super predator, and he used bad statistics on a small sampling of young people in Philadelphia to basically predict that there would be a generation of godless, fatherless young men, particularly Latino and African-American boys who were going to come to wherever you were and hurt you, right? And so that was the narrative and the dog whistles that we were hearing. And the unfortunate part, when I mentioned the silence around the Central Park jogger young men who were involved once they were released from prison and from being falsely accused and convicted, and you didn't hear much. You also don't hear a lot about John Giulio. He's a tenured professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he simply, his language led to multiple generations of young people being put into the adult court system. All the tough on crime policies that we've all lived through in different ways. Really, he was the precursor, or really helped start that. And so his impact has been really harmful. And he's pretty much just said, yeah, I used bad science, my bad, and has continued on with his career. And so when we think about accountability and what it looks like, even that is powerful. And then we have Rodney King, which, reflects the first kind of viral video of things that were happening in communities of color that folks who live in those communities had known were occurring for generations, right? But as we think about what we see now, what has become almost sadly the norm for what we see, Rodney King was sort of the beginning of that in the way of video. Next slide. And so then as the 2000s come, we start to see, right, children of color overrepresented in both the child welfare and justice systems. We're seeing the 3 times more likely First Nations youth to be removed from their homes. We're seeing colorblind tools be pushed. So the idea that if we just use these colorblind tools, we can address the disparities that we see. And what we know from those tools is that they often actually grew the gap, widened the gap, and were problematic, right? And that there was really federal funding streams incentivized out-of-home placement. That out-of-home placement that began with the orphan trains, right, to come many, many decades later, and to see that in the 2000s, right, how funding even drove out-of-home placements and how problematic that was. The next slide. And so then as we get to the 2000s, again, we see, and we're going to speak to family separation for so many communities of color, right? But in the 2000s, we saw the implementation of family separation policy, which we know had a massive impact on Latinx families. And it caught international attention around the border for a period of time and around immigration policy for a period of time, but it's not actually new, right? And so if we go to the next slide, right? So throughout history, when you think about what we've seen, right, for African Americans, looking at the Japanese internment, Latinx community, like the idea, the theme of the separation of families, right, in communities of color. And I mean, you need to sit with that though, right? That's the separation of families. It's not that the breakdown of family just randomly happens, right? That there were policies and practices that really were the impetus for a lot of family separation occurred across many different communities of color, right? Think about the post-traumatic stress this leads to, the loss of sense of identity and self-concept, developmental disability issues, multi-generational trauma, all the things that are connected to this separation are important to kind of sit with and to realize and to acknowledge. They're very important. And that they're thematic. And so again, it's not just this happened to one group and not, it's a theme of how policies and practices have impacted communities of color. Next slide. And it's a quote, and I guess it's good Sam's not here because I can read her quote. We were in a conversation and she said, prevention without a racial justice focus. The prevention without a racial justice focus is an effort to prevent white families from experiencing harm. Without intentionally focusing on race and ethnicity, your strategies will, by default, always cater to white normative culture. So again, just to make the point about the white dominant culture, the water we swim in, we are all the fish, and how do we break out of that? That requires a level of intentionality. It requires a level of being very intentional of dealing at the root causes, unpacking and deconstructing these issues, okay? Next slide. So as we get into, as we're still going this historical walk, right, 2014, 15, middle of that decade, we saw two situations, Ferguson and Baltimore, right, where there was uprisings in each. And I think the important point here is that in Ferguson, it made sense for people intellectually because you had a predominantly white law enforcement force. You had white local leadership. You had over-policing, chronically disinvested communities, and you had tension, right? And so people, when that happened, people understood that equation. Baltimore with Freddie Gray, which happened soon after, was a little different, right? Because there was predominantly Black police forces, Black leadership, similar disinvestment, similar tension. But when people saw that, some folks are confused because they say, well, wait, there are people of color in power. And so I think the important point for this slide is, again, going back to the language we started with, the core concept, structural. So just that the fact that you have a diversity or that you have people of color in particular positions is not enough to overcome the structural impact of these systems. Because these are still faces of color, but within the same structure. So transformation requires thinking about how do we deconstruct, right, and rebuild some of these structures, right, to get past that structural challenge that we have. And so it's just important to make that distinction when we think about two incidents that were very similar, but often perceived very differently by people. And next slide. And so now getting to 2020, I'm not going to sit in the global pandemic too much. We all experienced it and lived it. But what we saw was a few things happen, these 4 R's, right? So there was a reaction. Pandemic starts March 2020. The world sort of takes a breath, a collective breath. The country definitely did. We talk about things like 6 feet apart, aerosol, spit, spray, masks, all those things we were talking about. Can get on your hands, all that, right? We all had a reaction. There was a release. And so when we talk about release, really thinking about the justice side. We saw systems who had been bogged down, jails and youth detention centers around the country, who did not move quickly, moved amazingly quickly. We had major metropolitan areas on the East Coast, I know for a fact, who reduced their arrest rate by 97% in a month. We had detention centers and jails reduce their populations by 30, 40, 50% in several weeks. There was a level of energy, creativity, innovation that was occurring to get folks back home. What we also saw was the racial disparities that we knew existed, or many of us knew existed, were exacerbated, heightened, and highlighted, right? Who still had to go to work? Who was considered the essential workers? Which communities were most impacted by the pandemic, right? Who was being hurt by that as much? Who were losing their jobs, right? Even when the vaccination started, who sort of often we were hearing stories of people cutting lines, going to communities they never went to get the vaccination, right? We saw disparities heighten. And then the rebound part is what we're battling against now, which is we're starting to see numbers and just behaviors go back to what they were pre-March 2020. And the work is really, how do we dig into this and grab onto transformation, understanding it's a journey, it's work, but how do we move toward that, right? You can go to the next slide. And just the important part of the next couple of slides, including the Black Lives Matter slide that was just previous, all of this is on our watch. So whatever we want to say about it, it's on our watch, right? So the January 6th piece, for a lot of folks, it reflected the domestic terror highlighted in that map that I showed you a few slides before. There was something felt very violent about it, right? So that was just real. And this is on our watch. What will we do? You go to the next slide. And so similarly, when we think about, right, when the anti-Asian violent attacks occurred, right? And I think the important point here is not necessarily new. When we think about Japanese internment, we think about the treatment of Chinese, building the railroads, like there's a history. So it might have felt new for some people, but when you understand that history, it's really the continued othering, right? That was occurring. And so and to have that history as a backdrop is important. You go to the next slide. And then we have the issue with the Haitian folks coming across the border and this visual. And I would ask you, we've been in some settings where people say, like, this happened, did it not? And there's public debate about it. And what we say is when you see the visual and you understand the history, that's actually the problem. It's not every detail what occurred in this one incident, but it's to understand the history that we exist in, this visual, and what was happening during this time. Right. And so, and part of this is that this is all on our watch. All of us on this call right now, all of these things we just showed you, it's for us to figure out how do we keep getting better, how do we improve, and how do we transform these systems from where we are. So we can go to the next slide. Now, if we were all together, we would have had more time and we would have given you a definite break, but I'm not. I'm going to push through. But what I just took you through, again, the first few slides were just on concepts and a couple additional frameworks, including talking about mental models, because all the things we just saw in history, right, there are mental models that support those, that are the foundation of those policies, practices, and behavior. We walk through history up until current with an understanding that where we are now is in 1842, is in 1902, but we own the things that are occurring now. We all have an obligation, or we would say we have a responsibility to try to impact that. So what does that mean, right? How do we actually make change? And so part of it for us is really looking at the characteristics of white supremacy culture and asking the question, and again, this is not for white people, it's for all of us. How do we get to become the goldfish that jumps out and gets free of that culture, that dominant culture? Am I open to the possibility that some of what I have been taught may not be true? And that's a powerful thing to have to challenge yourself on. Am I open to the possibility that what I've been taught may not be true? And if so, am I open to different ways, alternative ways of thinking and approaching these issues? And so that's kind of when we think of transformation, that's the challenge, is how do we engage that, right? And how do we break what I just walked you through of 500 years of history? How do you feel like you're not going to drown in that? Because that field can feel super heavy, super big, right? And be open to the idea that the first question, the possibility that some of what you've been taught may not be true, is the first step in interrogating it. Interrogating, what do I know? What do I know? Why do I think what I think? How do I explore my mental models, right? And so just to put that out there. Next slide. And so this is out of this information is out of a piece by Tema Okon and Kenneth Jones, and it's we have this linked in at one of the slides near the end with some additional resources. Very helpful, we think, tool. Characteristics of white supremacy culture. I won't go through all of them, but it gives you, and we're going to go through a couple to show you, like, what do you do with this? And here's the thing: we all have these things. These are not, these are not unique to one person or to white people or to people of color. All these characteristics are things we deal with in different ways, and we're trying to navigate, work through. They're not all explicitly negative either, right? But in the context of white supremacy culture, there are things we feel like can be negative, and we need to really think about and explore, right? So just some of the ones I think are very common: individualism, competition is more valued than cooperation, a sense of urgency, there's no time to be inclusive. That's a big one in human services, right? Where we have often unrealistic timelines timelines. There are things that happen, situations based on your work that are super urgent. But how do you bring folks in to make sure we're being thoughtful in how we respond, right? Quantity over quality. If it can't be measured, it has no value, right? Versus sort of qualitative information, right? Verbal narratives, what people speak and feel. Paternalism. Those in power believe they can make decisions for everyone, right? And so in human services work, that's often something we all have to be careful of, right? Not being paternalistic. Defensiveness, criticism of those in power is rude or threatening. Right to comfort, talking about race makes me uncomfortable, so stop. Fear of conflict, people in power ignore or avoid conflict. I reference those three because, right, as we think about how do we even have these conversations, we have to disabuse ourselves or get rid of these concerns or fear of open conflict. We have to push ourselves to be uncomfortable, and we have to let go of our defensiveness, which we all have in different ways, right? And so to wrestle with that. We go to the next slide. And so just an example, paternalism, so taking the characteristics, and this tool has what they call antidotes, right? What do you do with that? And so the antidotes for paternalism, right? Cultivate transparency and open dialogue around decision making. Ensure that everyone has a part in important decisions. Make sure everyone knows and understands their level of responsibility and authority in the organization, and include those who are impacted by a decision-making process. These don't all necessarily fit perfectly in your everyday professional existence, but they're the great tips, tools, and things you can put in practice. Something will fit, right? And it's the idea of like, how do we include those impacts? What does that look like in whatever you do, right? But being aware that that's a fix, the notion of paternalism. That's an antidote. Next slide. And so just one other one, sense of urgency. And what's important here is that there is this thing we do when we're trying to solve a problem, where we jump from awareness, I've identified there's a problem, and we jump straight to action, right? We jump straight to action. We skip all this other stuff because we're urgent. We don't have time. Build relationships and trust, right? Gather information and analysis, visioning and planning space. And what we say is, though, if you don't do those things, if you don't spend that time, you're on a hamster wheel. So you'll have awareness, you will have action, but that action will not be sustainable. That action will not get you to the root causes you're trying to address, and you'll have to go back in this circle. And so, again, just something we like to lift up, because all of us, this is a struggle. And in human services where things can be urgent, and they are, right, it's how do you build relationships and trust? What does that look like? Particularly if it's a practice you haven't done or not currently doing, right? You can go to the next slide. So this is a chart. I'm going to try to push through quickly. In about 10 minutes, so we want to allow questions and answers, Q&A time. So this is a tool we use, Stages of Structural Racism Awareness. It's a tool that really for us has helped start to normalize conversations, get folks comfortable talking about these issues that often we don't want to talk about. And just to take you on the continuum, when you think about sort of the very left-hand side, completely unaware, we often hear these quotes, I don't see color, it's about poverty, we use race-neutral tools, I talked about that earlier, that I'm not racist, some of my best friends are, and someone plugs in whatever group of people of color they want. Defensive and denial, I had nothing to do with it, get over it, prove it, right? You have to prove to me that there's an issue. I'm not racist, some of my best friends are, and incorporate a group of people of color. And then a little more to the right, acknowledges, this is when someone acknowledges extreme forms of interpersonal racism, right? So this is someone who identifies and can see, disapprove of a racist person's actions. You can look at a Karen in the park and say that's wrong, right? But I'm not racist because some of my best friends are, integrate a group of people of color. Then the next one, my family, this is acknowledges racism, denies privilege. This is where a lot of the conversation in the past couple of years in the public has been. My family has struggled, all lives matter. I feel personally attacked by this conversation, right? We just talked about the characteristics around the right to comfort, fear of open conflict, defensiveness, right? So that whole, I feel personally attacked by this conversation is why we often don't finish those conversations, because folks disconnect from one another. And then as you move to the right, begin to see structural inequity. So this awareness comes with disappointment as this new reality contradicts your worldview. I feel very personally angry, guilty, and upset. So after George Floyd, a lot of that occurred, right? I would say for lots of folks during the Me Too movement, this same analysis, not race specific, right, occurred, right? Worldviews were shifted. I would say I was like, oh, I didn't know that to that level, right? So just understanding this awareness comes with disappointment as this new reality contradicts your worldview. One more to the right, connects the dots between inequity and privilege. So this is now just acknowledging, yet my privilege does not reflect my morality, but my response to it does. And let me be very clear, the fact that we're all on a Zoom call and a webinar right now during the middle of the day, right, there's different privilege shows up for all of us in different ways. So the point isn't that you have privilege, but what is your response to it, right? And it's important. So it's not to feel some guilt because you have any level of privilege. This is what you do with it. And then leaning in, comfortable with the discomfort. So this is now getting past that right to be comfortable characteristics and the fear of open conflict. Conversations about race are no longer threatening. Now that I see structural racism, I can never unsee it, right? So this is now getting to that place. And then the last one being the change and making the change. I understand that we need to close the racial ethnic gaps that structural racism produces and create more equitable opportunity. And so just remember, this for us is understanding the history and starting to be self-reflective. And we feel this tool gives you space to start being self-reflective. And just, it's something folks can journal on. It's not just for white people, it's for everybody, because it impacts everybody. And you're never necessarily the same thing every day, right? But it's just, again, another tool to help start conversations that we think are important to get toward transformation. And you can go to the next slide. So this is a newer slide we've been using, the lifespan of structural racism. And just to kind of give folks just another way when we're talking about structural racism, and it can seem abstract and huge, just another way to think about it, right? Kind of the lifespan of structural racism. And so just starting from the left, structural, right? So colonialism, manifest destiny, slavery, racial hierarchy, poverty, right? These structural issues all exist in the concept of white supremacy. So that's what it manifests as. When we look to the right, institutional, right? Inequities around corporations, businesses, government, agencies, education, health, law and order, nonprofits. Institutional piece, the idea of it shows up we're colorblind, there's race neutrality, right? So these are all race neutral things, they just exist. Social, looking at race, ethnicity, socioeconomic issues, immigration status, gender expansive identity. So these are all things that actually should be really empowering, beautiful things that are often not, right? Because we're othered. These are concepts or notions of self-concept, self-esteem, but often used in ways that are completely harmful toward people because we other people, right? Based on these different categories. When we look at environment, right, the physical, social environment, chronic disinvestment, right? So we have places in every county, every town, every city in this country, right, where there's chronic disinvestment, where there's segregation, where there's over-policing, and where there's limited access to opportunity, right? And so this limited access often is disguised as meritocracy. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, work harder, right? So again, it just reflects the lifespan of how structural racism works through these different pieces of our existence. Behavior, right? Youthful misbehavior, substance abuse, those are considered very normal, right, things. Any of you, I have 4 teenagers. I don't know if any of you do. I should be way more gray. Oh, I don't have any hair, that's why, right? So 4 teenagers. Youthful misbehavior, it's what they do, right? Substance abuse is actually very normal developmentally for young people. Exposure to violence is not, right? Exposure to violence is something different that a lot of young people are exposed to, people in communities have to often deal with, which is different, right? But it allows for the opportunity to blame individuals who are impacted by that violence, right? Moving to the right, freedom. And so, we think about surveillance and control, arrest, incarceration, the family separation that we noted on a previous slide, this overall oppression, right? So these become tools to maintain a racial caste system. And then finally, that mortality piece. When you think about infant mortality, life expectancy, disease, what we often talk about the violent application of unjust public safety. So for the Burns Institute, we distinguish between community safety and public safety. Public safety being that what is referred to the violent application often, sort of what we often hear about and how it's put on communities. COVID, right? And so it's just to give you another look at how try to break out and unpack what structural racism looks like actually in our life, in our actual lifespan, right? Born into the structural piece, then in the middle as you grow, right, institutions in that job space or that corporate space, the business space, thinking about just social issues, who you are as a person, your own self-concept, that is impacted by structural racism. Looking at where you live and the environments that you exist in, right? And you're being constantly told there's a limited access though to these things, but you're being told it's really meritocracy when it's not, right? How we behave, right? As young people or just people, we're navigating life and how that's often flipped back, and we look at individual blame as opposed to looking at structure, right? Thinking about freedom, and how so much of what's done in the name of public safety is the opposite of that, and maintain the current structures and systems. And then that mortality piece, right, which plays out at the end of the day, how we all live and our life expectancy and all those things that actually affect our everyday. And so just wanted to take you through that as another way to unpack structural racism. And we can go to the next slide. And so this slide, we'll get a couple more slides when we're done. Anchoring the work. And so for us, it's about anchoring the work in trust and really just understanding the need. So if you are going to tackle transformation, if you're going to address racial justice, you're going to attack race, ethnicity, equity work, it's important, one, to build trust with one another, to think about what tables you're at, what are the values, and creating shared values. How do you have the conversations with one another about these issues? And then on the left-hand side, it's really about the top bullet is working with or within systems that are rooted in oppression and inequity. Working with or within systems that are rooted in oppression and inequity. And to do that is to look at that left-hand chart, person role system. To do that is to navigate and to wrestle with who you are as a person, because that does not always align with your professional role, which may not always align with the systems within which you work. And so the work for us to get towards transformation requires us to tackle that person role system framework. And we would encourage, or we would suggest, or we would implore that it requires you to have trust with your collaborative table or the folks that you're partnering with, but to really think about the shared values and develop shared values with folks, spend time doing that, and developing working agreements, which for us are just a way to engage conversation, engage these issues, because often it's the lack of conversation and our inability to have the conversation that prevents the work from happening. Next slide. And then just for us, centering community is just a value we have. And I think the last bullet is the most important in the sense of believing that those closer to the issue have the solution, right? Power sharing, what does that look like? Going past community engagement, so going past just having a person from a community be at a particular table, but what does real power sharing look like? Understand where you sit in these concentric circles, right? Are you the cross-sector agency? Are you community expert? Are you intermediary? Where are you a funder? Really seeing where you are, and how do we, in the work to center this in actual folks who are most impacted by the issues within which that we work on behalf of. And go to the next slide. And just, for developing focus strategies, just ways we think about if we are trying to deconstruct, right, structural racism, if we are trying to go to a space of transformation, to really get past dancing around the edges of traditional work, but really get toward a new day when we really take our learnings and implement them. Think about who are your focused populations for your strategies, what are the specific conditions and context, right? Including what's that history, what are the root causes your strategies address. So again, getting the depth of the mental models piece. How are impacted constituents engaged? How are you going to share power share, co-design, bring folks in, right? And then looking how do your strategies close gaps and advance opportunities. Just some very high level sort of ways we think about how do you focus a strategy to start to unpack, deconstruct structural racism in what you do in your work. Next slide. I think we're done. That's it. So, and that's kind of the question we leave, and we just like this picture. The deck, I think everybody was said, will be shared out, and there's a slide at the very end that has some additional resources, just some really helpful assessments and other tools folks can use, and you might have seen some of them, but you can access to just help support what you all are doing. So I think that's the last slide, so I think we can stop share. And I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Yes. So it's time for Q&A. If folks have any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. I didn't see any questions in the chat. I know we had a few comments that Michael addressed, but just leaving the space open right now for a few minutes.
And I also know it's a lot of information in a short period of time, so just appreciate folks hanging in with that.
There's a request to see the resource slide, if possible. Can we pull up the resource slide? Oh, is it? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and this is just some. We have other curated materials. So again, just to get folks started, and some of these are things folks may have already seen, but and you'll have this again. I think it'll get sent out, so folks will have this.
Yes, thank you, Michael. We will be sending out all the materials in the next couple of days. Hopefully by the end of the week, you should receive the recording and then the slide deck. Another question. What do you hope that we will take away with us aside from what we are already walking away with?
Oh, that was a question to me. I mean, I think that's a good question. Well, I hope it just helps give additional context for folks. The history part. The thing about the history is, unless you're really interested in history, like we're not taught that in school. And we're not necessarily given that as part of your training for the jobs that we're all in. So I'm an attorney who's been doing this work for 20-something years. This is not information that I learned anywhere. And so just to have a context, and I also think, you might see things that you say, I don't know if that's true or not. Well, we hope it encourages you to go explore, right? But to really think about your local context, because there's a reason why MLK Boulevard looks the way it does in most places. There's a reason why particular areas of communities look the way that they do or resource like they do, have food deserts or not, right? And so it's just hopefully sparking interest in those kinds of issues, which relate to the families and communities that you serve.
Thank you, Michael. And there's another question. Could this same process be used working to address bias against LGBTQ individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did another presentation recently for, I feel like, a grouping of y'all from California on our structural well-being process. And I would say all of this, because it's just trying to unpack people's stuff. So I feel like on LGBTQ, on this gender, I think all of the same process and thinking is really looking at all of this. And part of when I mentioned the well-being, because for us, what we're trying to go to is really go more cross-sector where, look, we all sit in the room. So everything is connected. And so how do we all get in the room together and not be so siloed in how we think about these issues and try to address them?
Any other questions, folks, before we close our session today? So thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and the presentation was fabulous. So just as a reminder for folks, next week on the 13th at 11 a.m., we will be having another session. And we hope you can join us. We'll be sending out the flyer along with this material today and the recording of the material by the end of the week. Thank you all. Let me just, there's one other question. No, that's it. I think that's it. Actually, there is actually one other question here, more of a request. Please expand more on how there can be an organization that is representative, that it's representative of the community and of people of color and still be impacted by systems that are influenced by racism. I'm not sure. Can you see that question, Michael?
Yeah, hold on. Yep. I think it's a great question. I want to make sure. I'm just trying to make sure it's still being heard. It's not right. So it's all right. So if I understand the question right, I feel like they're asking like how do you do this in the context of you're still working within systems that are influenced by racism? And I think we hold two truths when we do this work. There's sort of I'm going to use language that's a little off, but like harm reduction, which is very much the traditional work that a lot of folks have done that I had a career of for a long time. That is operating within the context of sort of dominant culture that you're reflecting, right? Systems that are influenced by racism. For us, transformation is actually centering the work in community, right? In community. And so we're in jurisdictions now. I have a meeting tomorrow in St. Paul, Minnesota, where they have a collaborative of half community folk, many who have lived experience, half systems folks, and they are trying to share power in a very different way. But I think part of this is you got to dance with the two truths. It just is because we're trying to get out of something, and so it's still there, and that's a reality. We have to, we can't pretend it's not there, but it's definitely the two truths. I'm hoping that answered your question.
Sounds like, according to the chat, it did. Right. And so one more reminder. So next week, April 13th, we're having a session on redesigning child welfare around prevention, equity, and well-being, part 1. And it's a 2-part series. So it'll start April 13th at 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Pacific. And the second part will be on April 20th, 2022. And again, at 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. And again, it'll be focused on economic supports to address. Thank you again, Michael, so very much. We appreciate your time, and we look forward to everyone joining us again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you.